In this lesson video, we're going to go ahead and use the DBAdapter file that I have on the lesson to be able to add it to our application. So I'm just going to go ahead and restore down my Eclipse here. And I have the zip file sitting here on my desktop. I will need to extract that. I'll go ahead and close that. You'll see that the folder here is going to contain the actual file that you just saw here. This is the file that I need to move into my application. So if I drag this over here and drop it on my package name com.example.todo list, it'll ask me if I want to copy the file there or link it. I'm going to go ahead and choose to copy the file. And you'll see that file has now been added to our application. Let me go ahead and maximize this again. And I'm going to go ahead and double click on the DBAdapter.java file. You do want to make sure that the package is going to be the same name as yours. And so if you are using this to work on a completely different application, change the package name to match yours. And you may have to take a look at the import statements to make sure everything is correct with your import statements as far as switching from one application to another. And what I have here now is the file that will actually interact with our database for us, create the database, update the database, and do everything that's necessary to work with the database on our Android device. As I scroll down through here, a couple of things that you may need to change. You can see that I have the row ID here called ID, and then I have another string here called key task that's going to include the next field name, and then the key date is going to be the next field name. If you want to add additional fields, you would add that right here in this section of our code. With that said, if you added any more additional fields, you're going to want to come down to the column numbers and add additional columns to match those fields. And you can see here that column and row ID and key and row ID are going to line up to be the same. And then task and then date, task, date. As every field name gets added, you're going to want to increment that to the right column number. So we're going to start off with column 0 as being the first place, then 1, and then 2. I have some information here on the name of the database, which is going to be called DBToDo, and the table is going to be called MainToDo. And you see here this one says database version 2. Typically we start with version 1. If we make any changes to the structure of the database, it is crucial to change that number. And I've started this one at 2, and that's because while I was working with the code I made a change and I incremented that up to 2. You can start that off on 1. Just remember that if you start making any changes to the structure, once the database has been created in your application, you will want to increment that. Here you'll find the SQL statement that's going to actually create the table that we need. And you can see here that if you do add additional fields, then you're going to need to add them in here as well. And this is basic SQL syntax. We can see the key task. We're going to go ahead and add to it the character type of text. For those of you who work with SQL, you may want varchar, and you can also set things like not null or any other attributes that you want to it. The one above it is the row ID, which is my primary key. It is an integer data type. It is set as the primary key, and it is also set to auto increment the numbers. So additional fields would mean additional SQL statements in here to add those fields to your database. Coming down a little further, you'll see we have an object called myDBHelper, which is going to be created from the database helper class, which is going to be down further in my code. I'm also going to be opening the database and getting it writable so that I can make the changes to it. We also need to close the database often. Every time we open it and we're done, we want to close the database connection. Down here a little further, you can see the code here to insert the rows. And so if you add additional columns, you're going to also want to insert that data, and you're going to need to add additional values here that match the field names that you entered up above. Coming down a little further, this is the code right here to actually insert the values we were putting up there. I also have code to delete an individual row and code to delete the entire table itself. Now coming back up here to the row, you can see that it's going to delete an individual row, and if you read through the code, it's going to be based on the row ID, which is our primary key. I'm going to come down a little further, and you can see that there's a cursor here, which is going to be able to allow us to navigate through all of our records on our database. Coming down a little further, I have the code down here to update the actual row whenever we want to update one value to another. And as I come down a little bit further, I have my class database helper, which is going to extend that SQLite open helper. And this is going to allow us to create and upgrade the database whenever changes are needed. So this makes up the database helper DBAdapter class, which will allow us to have our activities interact with the database through this. In the next lesson, we're going to go ahead and take a look at working with our activity using this DBAdapter class that I've created so that we can add data to our database.